Hello, my name is Rachael Soto, and welcome to my presentation on Robert Coles and the theory of moral development. I really enjoyed learning about Robert Coles. As you can see from his timeline, he has had a rich career. His education began in 1950 when he received his BA in English Literature at Harvard University. After that, he was urged to study psychiatry, which he went on to do at Columbia University. Afterwards, he had joined the Air Force and was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi. At that time, he met Ruby Bridges, an event that he said changed his life and shaped his career afterwards. He's held many professional roles at Harvard University, where he has taught a variety of courses in psychiatry, but also in English literature. You can see also that he had a prolific writing career. In 1970, he wrote a 5-volume series called Children in Crisis, which won him a Pulitzer Prize. He has published many other books, including The Spiritual Life of Children, The Call of Service, The Moral Intelligence of Children, and also a children's storybook called The Story of Ruby Bridges, and many other publications the list is too long to mention here. Robert Coles has received many honors and awards for his years of interviewing, researching, and writing about children. Robert Coles was influenced by a variety of people. As you can see, some were in the field of child development, such as Anna Freud and Erik Erikson, while others were political figures, such as Robert F. Kennedy and even Dorothy Day. His mentor was William Carlos Williams. He was a physician and a poet, and influenced his career very early on by urging Robert to pursue a career in child psychiatry. I wanted to include some of the influences of Robert Coles. In his books, he often writes about these figures, and it shows how much they influenced him in his personal life and his career. Some were in the field of child development, such as Anna Freud and Erik Erikson, whom he knew both personally, and others such as Robert F. Kennedy, who he did have interactions with, and Dorothy Day, were in the political arena, but both lived a very moral life and had vocal messages that resonated with him. William Carlos Williams was a poet and a physician whom Coles developed a friendship with, and he was the person who urged him to go into the field of child. Again, Robert Coles had such a prolific writing career, and some of the areas of research and writing he did were on the following: children in times of crisis. This came right after he met Ruby Bridges and was exposed to the social unrest of the South. But he didn't stop there. He traveled the world in war-torn countries and even more rural areas, and wanted to see how children handled crisis and difficulties. He also wrote about the political lives of children, the spiritual lives of children, and the moral lives of children. And in addition, he wrote biographies of people who lived a moral life. As a researcher, Robert Coles had a very specific methodology. His main form of research was interviews, and he liked to do the interviews in the child's environment. I have read that he disliked clinical settings very much. So he would make an effort to travel and be where the children were. He was a great listener. He would also incorporate drawings that the children would do in relation to what they were talking about. And he felt that this added much depth and value to the interview. He also would stay quite a long time with one person or a group of people. He wanted to develop that long-term relationship. And Mr. Coles also used direct observation. And he also did some group work and wrote about that in his books. Robert Coles had a very specific methodology for his research, and his main method was through interviews, and specifically in the child's environment. He very much disliked clinical settings. He was able to use direct observation during the interview and outside of the interview. And he would travel great distances just to observe children and interview them in their natural environment. He was a great listener, and he liked to use drawings as part of his research. He felt it added great depth and value to the topic at hand. And he also valued long-term relationships. He would try to spend as much time as possible to get to know each child, and he developed a great regard and relationship with people. And he also did some group work with adults or with children. Robert Coles had a very specific form of methodology for his research. He primarily used interviews. He disliked clinical settings very much, and he would travel the world just to interview children in their environment. And it was at that time where he used direct observation, whether it's in the interview or observing them on their own in their environment. He was a great listener, and he used drawings with children, as he felt it just added great depth and value to the topic at hand. He developed long-term relationships with the people he interviewed, and he also used group work in his research. And you can see large clips of conversations from his interviews in his writings. Robert Coles had a very specific methodology for his research. His main method was through interviews. He disliked clinical settings very much, so he would travel a great distance to interview children in their own environment. He was a great listener, and he incorporated drawings in his interviews, as he felt it added great depth and meaning to the topic at hand. And he liked to develop long-term relationships. He also used direct observation, whether that was during the interview or outside of the interview, in the child's natural environment. And Robert Coles also wrote about his group work. I would be remiss if I did not talk to you about Ruby Bridges. In 1960, as I mentioned, Robert Coles served in the Air Force and was stationed down in Mississippi. And he describes in interviews that I have seen and heard of how he was stuck in traffic, and that was when he learned that this 6-year-old girl was one of the first of 4 children to integrate some schools in the South. So Ruby Bridges was in New Orleans, and on that day that Robert Coles was stuck in traffic. He observed crowds of people heckling, cursing, yelling, and protesting the integration of that school. And Ruby Bridges was the focus of that hatred. And so Coles was astonished by her quiet dignity, as he calls it, and at her moral insight. There is one interview that Coles brings up quite a bit. There was a day when Ruby Bridges was walking into school, and her teacher observed her moving her mouth. It looked like she was talking to the protesters. And Coles describes his interview with her, and he asks, well, what were you talking to them about? And she says, I wasn't talking to them. And as he continued to ask questions, he found out that Ruby was praying for them. And Coles describes himself as a fresh psychiatrist, so he wanted to hear that she was angry and disturbed and bitter, but instead what came out was that Ruby was sad for them. He said, don't you think they need feeling sorry for? And this just astonished Coles, and it really inspired him to turn his career into researching moral development, how children deal with conflict, and how they develop the knowledge of right and wrong, and just how to be a good person. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the story of Ruby Bridges. In 1960, as I mentioned in Coles's biography, he was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi in the Air Force as a psychiatrist. And he describes in an interview on YouTube how he was stuck in traffic one day, and he learned from a police officer that there was a huge protest at the time. And they were protesting this 6-year-old girl integrating one of the first schools in the South. And this girl was Ruby Bridges. She was one of 4 children to integrate schools, and hers was in New Orleans. And Coles saw Ruby being heckled, cursed at by hordes and hordes of white people, and she carried herself with what he calls a quiet dignity. And he wanted to get to know her, to know how she was dealing with this, just this hatred and social unrest. And when he volunteered his services to support the family and interview Ruby, and he was astonished by her moral insight at 6 years old. And he does describe a particular point in one of his interviews where, she talks about actually praying for the protesters. And Coles, as a young psychiatrist, expected to hear her talk about being angry or, just saddened, and but it was quite the opposite. Ruby said to Coles, don't you think they need feeling sorry for? And it just astonished Coles, and it inspired him to turn his career into researching moral development and how children deal with conflict and how they come to know right from wrong. And towards the end, more recently, I won't say the end of his career, but in 1995, he published this storybook for children called The Story of Ruby Bridges. So you can just see how much Ruby has influenced his life and his career. So Robert Coles studied moral intelligence, and I would say it was less of a theory and more of an urging to inform parents and educators that the moral life matters. And I think that is something that he felt was missing. He felt that there was much emphasis on the intellectual and the emotional development of children, but not so much on the moral development of children. And as he began researching children and gathering more knowledge, he found that children are capable of thinking morally, even as young as 1. And as they enter their elementary school years, it explodes. They can seek out answers. They actually long for the answers to pretty deep moral questions. And he learned that children learn moral development through mainly the observations of those around them. So, are the adults around them good role models? Do they act out what they talk about at home? And he really stresses that it is our civic duty to develop a child morally. And another aspect of his theory, I'll say now, is that moral development is just as important as intellectual or emotional development. And that it is our moral life that gives meaning and quality to all other parts of our life. So when that is lacking, so Robert Coles mainly studied the moral intelligence, and for this slide I call it a theory, but it is not so much a theory as it is an urging of Robert Coles to parents, caregivers, teachers, that the moral life matters. And he really felt that this was lacking, that there was much emphasis on the intellectual and the emotional development of children, but not much attention was paid to the moral development of children. And after years of interviewing children, he feels that children are capable of thinking morally as young as 1 year old. He also believes that children long for and seek out answers to, deep moral questions, and especially as they enter school at age 7 or 8, they're really capable of struggling and asking difficult questions. Children learn, as he came to know, mainly through observations of those around them. So are the adults around them good role models? Do they practice what they preach? Do they treat people respectfully? All those things. And he felt it was really our civic duty to teach our children morality. And he felt that it was our moral life that mattered most, that our moral life gave meaning and quality to all other parts of our lives. So how does a moral intelligence develop in a child? As I mentioned earlier, one of the main ways is through observation. So a child looks around at those around them and observes what they're doing, what they're saying. Does what they're doing match to what they're saying? How do they treat others? How do they treat themselves? And also through experiences of one's own actions. And that is something that happens throughout a lifetime. They need to practice, moral dilemmas. And it's also the responses of others as a result of something they've done or said. Repetition, as I said, they need many opportunities to observe and practice. And through stories, novels, and discussions of moral themes, Robert Coles was very influenced, by novelists and stories that taught moral lessons. And Coles believed strongly in volunteerism. I'm just focusing on others, and he believed it really was our duty to serve others. In The Moral Intelligence of Children, Robert Coles talks in length about a child's behavior and how this theory correlates to that. He does begin in infancy. He talks about how parents share their values even before a baby is born, by how they're taking care of themselves during pregnancy, and after, just how much love and affection and responsiveness to baby's behaviors, and the reciprocity of that. The baby responds also to the mother, and they begin to develop a reciprocity of feelings. They learn to feel connected, to love. There is gratitude in that responsiveness, and there's a shared respect. And he talks about how moral mutuality comes out of that. And as children grow, parents are role models. And he does talk about parents just doing their best. The usual behavior of parents. He realizes there are times when parents maybe go above and beyond, and boundaries are lowered, and they kind of spoil the child. And he also talks about, on the other end of maybe not being attentive enough to one's child, but he stresses how a parent usually behaves with their child is what's most important. And he talks about how parents need to practice what they preach. Are their actions meeting up with their speech? And how parents they begin by offering suggestions, instructions. They discuss the values, explain right from wrong, and then children become good witnesses. They observe and they imitate. And then it becomes a reciprocal relationship. Children ask questions. They begin to think morally about things, especially about age 5. And then at 7 or 8, it explodes. They're exposed to so many more people in their lives through school and other outside activities. And they're if they're encouraged to do good and they're practicing just a way of being with others, and they find out how to share themselves with others, and it's through opportunities teachers give them for class discussion about morality, or again volunteerism. It's those types of behaviors that they practice that increase the likeliness that they will develop morally. So here's Adam. He is my fictitious boy. He is in elementary school. And some of his developmental milestones are the following. In language, he speaks in full sentences. He communicates well with teachers and peers. Cognitively, he can count to 100. He knows how to add and subtract. And he is learning how to read. Socially and emotionally, he's made several friendships. He exhibits independence by going on play dates on his own. He likes to draw and play on the playground. He's able to take turns and listen to directions most of the time. Physically, he enjoys the playground, able to swing on his own, and he enjoys soccer, and he's able to write legibly. And morally, he uses please and thank you without prompting. He offers to help the teacher without her asking, and he shows compassion and respect for his peers. So I'm going to talk about Adam and where he is in his moral development. So Adam enjoys soccer. He plays on a team. He enjoys it very much. And his coaches and parents have observed Adam's compassion toward his peers, and they've spoken up about it. And because he has been seen to console his teammates, he'll run up to players who've fallen or gotten hurt and asked if they're okay. If he had been the one to knock a player down, he would offer his hand, pick them up, has apologized on his own. And this shows high regard for others, and as well as compassion for their feelings. When asked about his behavior and why he does what he does, Adam repeats the golden rule. He said he's trying to treat people the way he wants to be treated. And at home, he has observed his parents treat him and his siblings similarly, and has had many opportunities to practice saying sorry, even if it was a mistake. He's also had plenty of practice forgiving others when they've hurt him. Now, at home, Adam watches his parents volunteer. So again, they say it's important to help others, and he sees them doing it. So they volunteer together at a food pantry. And one thing they also do together is they make these blessing bags, and they fill them with items that a homeless individual might need when they're out living on the street, like soap and mittens and razors. And so they keep that in their car, and when they come upon someone who's homeless, they hand those out. So his parents have taken the time to teach him that people matter, and that to take time to apologize when they've made mistakes, to show compassion, and to just be compassionate when we do make our own mistakes. Their parents had also practiced saying sorry. So this is an example of where one 7-year-old might be in their development morally. And there's a quote by Robert Coles at the end, and I find it really summarizes, how moral intelligence is acquired. So I'll read that to you. Moral intelligence isn't acquired only by memorization of rules and regulations. We grow morally as a consequence of learning how to be with others, how to behave in this world, a learning prompted by taking to heart what we have seen and heard. The child is a witness. The child is an ever-attentive witness of grown-up morality or lack thereof. The child looks and looks for cues as to how one ought to behave, and finds them galore as we parents and teachers go about our lives, making choices, addressing people, showing in action our rock-bottom assumptions, desires, and values, and thereby telling these young observers much more than we realize. Thank you for listening to my presentation on Robert Coles and his theory of moral intelligence.